Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is Ukraine War News Update, first part there for the 26th of January 2024. Let's get straight to where we normally start. Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before, all the usual caveats apply, of course. You can find them in the description to this video below. And we have very high figures for personnel losses. Again, yesterday, 990 people lost. Russians killed or seriously wounded. That's how I would understand that. I know some people think that definitely refers to just killed, but I think they changed the terminology to personnel to incorporate the wounded as well. 8 tanks, 16 APVs and 15 artillery systems. That's going right back down from what we saw, those huge numbers over the last 2 or 3 days previously. I think there might well have been weather getting in the way. Who knows? Sometimes these numbers are affected by weather, by conditions on the battlefield, by what the Russians are doing. The Ukrainians are adopting a sort of active defense at the moment, although in Krinky on the Dnipro River, that's the only kind of offensive bridgehead that they are trying to maintain. Other than that, it's just soaking up the Russian pressure and trying to attract the Russians as much as possible. 8 tanks, 16 APVs and 15 artillery systems is still, you know, losses that are going to hurt for the Russians, just not nearly as much as we've seen recently. 1 cruise missile, that was from the day before, no doubt. 20 vehicles and fuel tanks and 5 pieces of special equipment. Again, not the highest numbers there either, but you know, that's still going to hurt the Russians somewhat. Now, I talk quite often about how, not so much today, but on previous days when we've seen like 59, I think it was yesterday, artillery systems lost. And then you look at the loss statistics for, say, Andrew Perpetua or War Spotting or Oryx, and you see the artillery doesn't quite match the numbers that the Ukrainian general staff are posting. What's going on there? What underwrites that difference? And I've proposed a number of different theories. I mean, it definitely skews towards FPV drone footage and IED dropping drone footage on these lists, not so much in terms of artillery gimlers, although there's a few gimlers there. Actually, what needs to be remembered is this, and this is, I've been reminded of this a number of times, I keep forgetting to relay it to you. But as Robert Mills here says on the thread, it's my understanding that both Ukraine and Russia consider 82mm mortars as an artillery system. And indeed, you know, I've been contacted by people in the military previously who say, yeah, in the British Army, we consider that, you know, mortars over this size as artillery. If this is the case, that explains the high numbers of losses and relative lack of visual confirmation of artillery losses, since there are many mortars in each infantry company located close to the front line, and destroyed mortars probably don't leave much behind, much evidence behind that can be confirmed by satellites. Mortars are important to the infantry, but not as valuable as or hard to replace as regular artillery pieces such as 152 and 15mm howitzers. So it could be that the Ukrainians are including larger mortars on their lists for artillery losses, and that's why you can see, you know, huge numbers posted in the general staff figures, but not match that up with recorded losses in other from other sources. Anyway, going to Andrew Perpetua's loss statistics, what he has seen in the last 24 hours. If you take out that decoy at the bottom of the list, then the Ukrainian losses are probably at Russian losses are at a 5-to-1 loss ratio, maybe, of Russian to Ukrainian. Which is exactly what the Ukrainians would like, and shows that every day at the moment seems to be really challenging for the Russians in with regard to their losses. That's not to say the Ukrainians aren't hurting because they have fewer bits of kit. This is why they need days of 5-to-1, because actually days that are 2-to-1, you might think, well, that's brilliant. Russians are losing twice as much equipment as the Ukrainians, but actually they have more than twice as much equipment to lose and personnel. So the Ukrainians really need really substantial differences, substantial loss ratios in their favor. Anyway, to go to the Ukrainians first, electronic warfare setup. Don't know whether that's a big bit of kit or just individual smaller bits of equipment. Boat artillery piece, then 3 T-64 BVs and some other bits and pieces, a couple of civilian vehicles, and another unknown tank there. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about T-64s. I have traditionally been saying that it's not so bad. These are older tanks, and the inference might be that they're not so good, etc., etc. And so you think, well, okay, the newer the tank in terms of T-64, T-72, T-80, T-90, the newer tank, the better. Therefore, the higher value, etc., etc. Actually, Andrew Perpetua reached out to me yesterday and said, "You got to be careful of that. That ain't actually necessarily the truth." And we can see this by the Ukrainian T-64BM Bulat. So this is a T-64. You think, well, it's an old tank. Well, actually, it's an upgrade of the aging T-64B main battle tank. Ukraine operates 2,200 of the old T-64 main battle tanks. This was obviously going back. The Bulat was revealed in 1999. So this was initially a 1999 upgrade. So it's not from the 1960s. And initially, 2 upgrade variants were proposed, the T-64BM, also referred to as T-64BU, and the T-64BM2. The BM2 was fitted with new automatic loader, however it had inferior fire control system. Eventually, the more advanced T-64BM upgrade was selected. First vehicles were upgraded and delivered to Ukrainian army units in 2005. In 2014, this main battle tank saw action during ongoing military conflict in Ukraine. It was widely used during this conflict. However, then they started, using the older ones again for some unknown reason. Anyway, protection was improved. Installation of add-on passive and explosive reactive armor (ERA). Composite armor is used on the front of the hull and turret. T-64 BM Bulat is fitted with Ukrainian NOS modular ERA, so again, explosive reactive armor, repeatedly recommended itself well. Vehicle is fitted with NBC protection automatic fire suppression systems, armed with a fully stabilized 125mm smoothbore gun, so that's a fully stabilized gun, with an automatic loader. And then, the engine is better. It was an upgrade of the previous T-64 power pack, which was notoriously unreliable, so on and so forth. And so, the T-64 BM2 is a further improved version, powered by a better diesel engine, etc., etc. And then, prototype tested in 2021 of another sort of variant there. So we might look at T-64s and think, right, old tank, load of rubbish type thing. But actually, it depends what variant it is. And in fact, when you look at some of the other tanks that say it's a T-72 OBR 2022, is it? Like a 2022 variant of the T-72, then you get another weird anomalous situation where that version is actually worse because of the inability of the Russians to get hold of equipment in 2022 for that upgrade. And so they actually, parts of the systems are sort of downgraded. They're newer built versions of the T-72, but they are unable to get the upgraded equipment. So you actually got a newer but worse version. So it really does depend on each individual variant as to whether it's better or worse than whatever benchmark you're using. So I need to be more careful when I'm thinking in those terms. So when we look at the Russian losses, for example, a number of boats. That's interesting because we've seen more boats lost for the Ukrainians over time. Surveillance and comms equipment, and just to let you know, and from sources, boats are still getting stuck in the ice. So Ukrainian boats, trying to relieve Krinky, for example, have notoriously been struggling with the ice there. That is still the case ongoing. Anyway, 4 Russian boats lost there, a number of artillery systems lost. And then we get onto tanks, and we have T-80 BVs, BVK, T-72 B3. So different variants will have different qualities. No T-64s there, but I need to obviously catch myself when I do refer to them. BMP2s and a few BMP1s today. I haven't seen 3 BMP1s lost in a single day for some time. Seem to be losing a lot more BMP2s and 3s for the reasons I've keep talking about. Trucks and civilian vehicles, a number of them high levels of those lost, meaning that logistics will be badly affected, or at least somewhat affected by the Russians. A number of Ural trucks lost there. And then when we see how they've been taken out, actually some Gimler's strike there, some loaves, pickup trucks, vans. I wonder whether that's got anything to do with what we're going to talk about in a minute, which is the strike on Ilovaisk, behind Donetsk, where the drone operators were hit. Major strike that was. And that could have been their equipment that was there helping them in that. But then basically a lot of FPV drones and drone drop munitions and all sorts. For the Ukrainians, actually Lancets, mines, artillery, bit of a mix there, to be fair. I don't know what the T-64 being damaged by a loaf entails here. I wonder whether a Ukrainian Bukanka has reversed into a tank or vice versa or something. Who knows? Right, then moving on to the strike on Ilovaisk. So this is a second FPV operator unit. So Moses was targeted. He was like the equivalent of Magyar, targeted around Krinky to the southwest of Krinky. And he went into a house with his unit, and that house was being monitored, and it was hit by an FPV drone, and Moses died, and I presume some of his unit. Anyway, that was a massive loss, as they were hugely skilled and had been causing the Ukrainians an awful lot of issues around that area with the success of their drone operations. Well, now another group, well, not so much a group, but actually a whole training area has been hit by Ilovaisk, which has caused quite an uproar. So this attack happened near Ilovaisk yesterday. Actually, that would have been now 2 days ago now. In total, 24 Russian FPV operators were killed and 4 were injured. This is a highly skilled role, and it hurts the Russians. So Tendai here is saying pro-Russian Romanov disclosed in one post that a group of Russian drone operators got a visit from a HIMARS missile. It happened due to the fact the commander of the drone operators disclosed their positions through a bot. I guess it means a Telegram bot, where somebody else, hello Budanov, was listening as well. It happened somewhere in Russian-occupied Donetsk. It ended deadly. Check out the translation. The translation is, HIMARS MLRS strike on the Ukrainian armed forces on a concentration of drone operators. The blow from the fighters' words was possible for the following reason. Quote, the head of the courses of the Doomsday Project, Pseudo Platov, with the call sign something that's been edited out, sent out without any verification through a bot to strangers the coordinates of where to come for training. The HIMARS have arrived. They are dead. There are dead. Now the management of the Pseudo Platov project is trying to hush up the situation and appoint the last of the dead, and this situation is not unique. No one else was hit in at the training ground, although there were more than 150 people there. Okay, interesting. Right. There is actually video footage of this now out, which is quite incredible because it means that this was being recorded by, this is being viewed by a separate drone behind enemy lines. We've seen this with the Russians behind Ukrainian lines. Often the ability to get drones, spotter drones, quite far behind lines is, you know, both sides are able to do that. It seems more than they should be, although it depends what drone it is that's spotting. Is it something that's at a very long distance, something like Bayraktar TB2 or something like that? I don't know. Anyway, footage emerged, says Dmitry from War Translated, showing a HIMARS strike carried out against the Ukrainian drone training center in Ilovaisk, Donetsk Oblast. According to the Russian sources, a number of exams were taking place at the spot. The location that the exams were sent out via Telegram. People gathered together, vehicles can be seen. So I think that these will be the vehicles that were taken out by the Gimlers, which we are now seeing on Andrew Perpetua's sheet there. This strike resulted in at least several dozens of dead, valuable Russian drone operators. And although they might be training, you don't know what level they were training, whether they're beginners just starting or whether they're getting upgraded training. I don't know. But this will be a big loss for the Russians for sure. Right, moving on. Oh, in fact, no, actually one more thing to say on this. Andrew Perpetua says, a pure joy I feel reading this. Now, this comes from the Pseudo Platov group, which, as I understand it, is the drone group that was training there. Now, Andrew Perpetua, when referring to Pseudo Platov, doesn't call them Pseudo Platov. Pseudo something else I can't repeat here, but it's not exactly nice. That's how much he likes Pseudo Platov. So he says, a pure joy he feels reading this. So we don't write much, says Pseudo Platov. We have grief and we mourn. We have lost friends and comrades. Condolences to family and friends. We will answer for everyone. We are grateful to our support. Ours are those who were and are there in joy and sorrow. All the others who use malicious comments to catch hype on the tragedy that happened, in this case, work for the enemy. And for us, you are not ours. We accept the fight, the dogs bark, the caravan moves on. Pseudo Plateau of the Storm. There you go. So that has happened. Visual evidence, several Russian sources talking about it. So that's happened, and it's been a sore loss for the Russians. Now, as well, there's been, and I'm sure there's footage out there for Russians doing similar stuff to Ukrainians. But if you want to check out this footage, it is linked below. I won't show you it, but it's a Ukrainian special force operation behind enemy lines. This is crossing Dnipro at night to destroy a Russian observation point in Kherson, somewhere on the Dnipro River. There was nocturnal activities going on that resulted in success for the Ukrainians there, but it is tough around there. As I say, the Ukrainians are losing boats full of people. Now, this is just a great video of a ground-based Jesus. What's great about this video is the music on it. It makes you feel for this robot, but I didn't mean that to blast my own ears off. Oh, that's not happened for a long time. Oh, the joy. Right, so this is a UGV, an unmanned ground vehicle that travels 4 kilometers to sit itself under a bridge, doesn't get blown up by anything, and then apparently successfully takes out the bridge, although we don't see any imagery of the bridge afterwards. We see the explosion, so I do hope it does actually do the required amount of damage. This is fantastic. It's a good use of innovation, and we see it, poodle off into the distance. Anyway, it comes across an abandoned tank here. It comes across a missile that's just sticking out the ground there. Interesting, random grad rocket or something sticking out the ground. Anyway, goes around. It just carries on 4 kilometers worth of uncontested driving with some pretty sizable explosives on. Sits itself under a bridge and then blows up the bridge. Unfortunately, we don't see. I mean, it looks like that will have been pretty much taken out as a bridge, but I don't know for sure it was. That's all we see, and then we go back to the crew. So we are starting to see new capabilities be used more widely on the battlefield. Now, talking about Russian losses here in terms of Nepalese citizens who have been recruited to fight for the Russians. Nepal demands from Russia to return the citizens recruited for the war in Ukraine, approximately 200 people, and to pay compensation for the dead. According to Nepal, Russia has the bodies of 12 of its 14 citizens whose deaths were confirmed in Ukraine. 5 more Nepalese are in captivity. So Nepal asked Russia to send back Nepalese recruited to fight in Ukraine, and the bodies of those killed. Right, moving on to distant strikes. There really were none in terms of anything overnight. It's worth noting, and this was from Michael Weiss interviewing an Estonian intelligence chap called Carl. Often does that really good thread. This well worth looking at the whole thread, but this is a part that I wanted to just focus on here. The intensity of Russia's missile attacks is clearly lower than it was last year. Then they had a weekly attacks with more than 100 missiles. Now the number of missiles is more around 40 attacks and are not weekly. In the beginning of winter last year, Russia even carried out such large-scale attacks twice a week. So last year you had twice a week attacks, sometimes with 100 missiles. And now you are getting not weekly attacks of 40 missiles. And I go back to the mantra, you would if you could, you aren't, so you can't. The only explanation that makes any sense is that they cannot fire this number of missiles. Someone came up to me the other day saying, well, actually, there could be another reason. It could be because they can't locate, there's something to do with intelligence, they can't locate as many targets. But that doesn't work, because what's happening is sometimes they're sending, say, 10 missiles, and so they do have targets. They're not just firing the missiles. Go, oh, we're going to shoot at there. Oh, look, in the middle of a field. No, so they do have genuine targets. So when they are sending missiles, they're sending genuine. They're firing at genuine targets. If they have another 400 missiles stockpiled, then they would overwhelm air defenses to hit those. So it may be that they can only find, I don't know, 5 targets rather than 25 targets. So they're not sending 100 missiles because they're only finding a fifth of the targets. But then they'd send surely 100 missiles at those 5. To totally take them out, totally overwhelm the air defenses, rather than send a bunch of missiles at fewer targets and go, well, we didn't do a lot of damage, did we? Because most of those were taken out. So even that kind of, not excuse, but that theory doesn't stand up as far as I'm concerned. The only explanation is that they are not producing and procuring enough missiles and enough drones to send repeated large-scale attacks at the Ukrainians, because we're not seeing them. And if we start seeing them, that's probably got something to the production ramping up. But we haven't seen them. It's been and gone. We've had most of winter has happened, and we've not seen many large-scale attacks. It hasn't happened. What did happen, well, this was from the day before yesterday, but it is still being sorted out, is S-300 missiles. These are surface-to-air missiles being used in a ground attack mode and are consistently thrown into Kharkiv, which is the second biggest city in Ukraine. It's on the northern border, very close to Russia, so they can easily send these things at Kharkiv. And unfortunately, I think 11 lives have now been lost. I know that says 10 there. I think there's another one that's just been found. So they're still picking up the pieces of S-300 attacks from a couple of days ago there. And then Kherson today has been, or yesterday possibly, 2 missile strikes against a residential building, a kindergarten and a shopping centre. A 54-year-old town resident was wounded in the leg and suffered blast injuries as Russia attacked Kherson with S-300s. Overnight, Russia fired, so it was overnight, 2 S-300 missiles at Kherson. So there you go. That was last night. So again, that's horrible. But, and again, it doesn't look at all like a residential target. Here we've got this old woman like crying at the destruction to residential areas. You're like, what are you doing, Russia? And then Russia has the bloody audacity to basically do this. And this absolutely irritates the hell out of me. I'm bumping this up the list. It's like they go to the UN Security Council to complain about the Il-76 crash. And meanwhile, they're sending S-300 missiles into Kherson and Kharkiv to hit residential blocks. It is, I want to really swear here, it is absolutely disgusting that they'd have the gall to go to the UN Security Council, complain about this plane being shot down, which was a plane being used for military purposes, while at the same time having spent 2 years obliterating civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. It's disgusting. And the United Nations is not in a position to verify these reports. So the Il-76 claims that it was carrying prisoners of war. More information is coming out about that makes it look even less likely that it was carrying prisoners of war. If you would have the evidence that it was, you would have provided it. You haven't, so you don't have that evidence. But they have the gall to say stuff like this, quote from the Russians at the UN Security Council meeting: Ukraine is buried in its lies regarding the Il-76 disaster. Says someone lying about the disaster and not providing the evidence to show that the Ukrainians are lying. He furthermore said that the US and Germany will be accomplices if it is proven that a Patriot or IRIS-T was used. I mean, the fact that they came out and said 3 Patriot IRIS-T missiles were used, and they said that within like 10 minutes of it being shot down or something. You're like, how do you know that? Dom Nichols was talking about this on the Ukraine the Latest podcast yesterday and the day before. Like, it was really convenient. Anyway, he said Russia is outraged. I mean, it's not to say it wasn't, but that bold claim so soon. He said Russia is outraged that international organizations refuse to condemn the crash, while also stating that Russia will do everything to ensure that all those responsible for the crash are held accountable. Just as people say, what? Like, what? What are you talking about? Have you not seen what you've been doing to Ukraine for 2 years? It's disgusting. Russian military and political VIPs were supposed to be on board the Il-76, but at the last moment, the FSB prohibited them to board, said Andrei Yusov, representative of Ukraine's main military intelligence directorate. He added that only 5 bodies had been delivered to the local morgue in Belgrade that day. Now, I don't know how he has that information, but, intelligence. If only 5 bodies were delivered to the morgue, then this looks rather like exactly what Ukraine say. It was a cargo carrying plane with S-300s on board or whatever it was. Now, interestingly, a GUR spokesperson, Andrei Yusov, stated that which is that same chap, I believe, talking. No, it was here. Anyway, yes, Andrei Yusov said that the planned POW exchange on the 24th was to be the largest exchange during the war. Quote, we don't have the exact number, but it should have been one of the largest exchanges until now. The 50th that would have taken place. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. Regarding the list that appeared through the Russian media, Yusov states that this is published to provoke a response. That's a list that had already had 17 people that were... had already been exchanged, and there's just more evidence coming out. I saw some footage over the crash site that shows a bit of blood, but considering there's supposed to be 73 people, you're like, there should be bodies all over the shop. You would have thought, and even in that footage with a bit of blood, it's like bright pink. You're like, I'm sure after this many hours, would that still? I don't know. Like when I see the fake videos of the Russian trenches of that Ukrainian set of Ukrainian soldiers supposedly, dying, and then you've got injured people, and it was a fake video, and they've got bandages. There's no bands or anything. It's just completely fake. But the bandages they have on and the blood that they've got on the ground is like really pink. That suggests like that's just fake. It's so fake. And then that's what I saw, like looking at and I don't know whether I'm just being too conspiratorial, but it just looked really unrealistic. And the whole place is cleaned up, and there, that you would close off that site so that emergency services can't do anything. That you would clean up the site as quickly as they did. That suddenly there's like 75 bodies not there. There's like a couple of patches of pink blood, but nothing else. And then you just. None of the evidence points towards it being. None of it points towards it being a cargo plane full of POWs. Could it be? I guess conceptually it could be, but in terms of probability, we are not justified in believing the Russians, and we are justified in believing the Ukrainians. In fact, I was like quite nonplussed by the Ukrainian response, that being quite ambiguous, but some people are saying, look, they just want to be as conservative as possible. They don't want to hang themselves out to dry if they are wrong, so they're taking things very methodically and slowly, and giving responses that could allow for either outcome to be the case. Maybe, but I mean, for me, the evidence is really only defends one thesis. Right, Putin apparently is sending signals to America through unofficial channels that it is open to discussing, or that he is open to discussing security measures for Ukraine, according to Bloomberg, with reference to sources in the Russian Federation. Allegedly, Putin is ready to consider renouncing the demand for Ukraine's neutral status and not joining NATO, but will insist on recognizing Russia's control over the occupied territories. This is huge if it's true. However, let's next reporting the same sort of thing. Putin referring to Bloomberg again, saying, security guarantees, not oppose NATO membership, but refuses to return occupied territories. So Crimea and those territories already under Russian control will remain in Russian hands. Quote, the Kremlin wants to end the conflict diplomatically, but will fight for Ukrainian lands to the last bullet if necessary. Okay. However, the Kremlin has now come out and said it does not agree with Bloomberg's report on the alleged readiness of the Russian Federation to abandon demands of Ukraine about its non-joining NATO and neutral status. Kremlin spokesman Peskov has said in the first response that the information is untrue. So whether that was actually happening behind closed doors, I don't know. But Peskov has very publicly said, "Hey, no, that's not what we want." And whether the public response is the important thing here, or whether it's the stuff beneath that's important, I can't say. I'm not sure that you'll get Ukraine agreeing to concede those territories. And the theory is that the Russians are agreeing because they see themselves as slightly in a more powerful position at the moment, given the Ukrainians' lack of support from the US in terms of the big aid package and the stasis on the front lines, so on and so forth. So now could be the right time to try and push forward with negotiations, because the Russians will be, as they see it, in a power position. I'm not sure that's actually true. So Tim White, now going back to planes. If you remember that plane that crashed in Afghanistan, that was a Gazprom Russian plane. Remember the plane crashing into a remote mountainous area of Afghanistan where all the crew survived, but the 2 passengers died? It's now reported that a mere $1.2 million worth of cash was stolen from the plane, a local newspaper reports. Gazprom plane going down, coming across from India. Money swapping hands, who knows? In the wake of ongoing heating water pipe problems in Novosibirsk, the local mayor has resigned, says Tim White. No official reason given for Anatoly Lokot quitting, but in Russia, in an election year, it's wise to quit early if bad news comes from your city. This is this ongoing issue, and we have another outage, this time in Biysk in Altai, 3,500 kilometers east of Moscow. The mains water pipeline burst. There's no electricity in part of the city, with local officials optimistically saying it's due to planned outages. Now, I say those 2 points on with reference or to give you foundation for what the UK intelligence stated yesterday, which is in recent months there have been heating breakdowns in 16 locations across Russia. These breakdowns amidst sub-freezing temperatures are an expansion of an existing problem that has plagued Russian cities and towns for decades, but has likely become more acute due to Russian wartime policies. Russia has routinely prioritized military spending over reinvestment in general public infrastructure, especially given their invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Many regional governments have been asked to take on the burden of operating with less federal revenue and have been asked to fund local volunteer forces, which has likely stretched their budgets and necessitated some cuts to maintenance spending. Additionally, mobilization has likely led to a workforce shortage across all industries, including qualified heating engineers and plumbers. Putin has asked the Minister of Emergency Situations, Alexander Kurenkov, to ensure the supply of heating and electricity to residents. Appearing to tackle the issue is likely a key concern for Putin ahead of the forthcoming Russian presidential elections. So this is such a big issue that's worthy of the whole of the intelligence update for the UK defence there. This is a mounting problem. It's a really interesting analysis I was listening to Ukrainian latest anyway along these sort of lines, that there are issues here, and there's also a growing, I might play this to you actually, I think it was a James Milner segment on Ukraine the Latest, which is the Daily Telegraph Ukraine podcast, talking about the upcoming elections in Russia and how there is one anti-war guy that used to be an advisor to someone in the cabinet or something, is now running and actually has got the 100,000 signatures. And it's one of those things where does the Kremlin allow him to run? Where he's gathering quite a lot of momentum behind him. Do they allow him to run and only allow him to get a certain amount of voting? Because it looks like they're going for electronic voting machines, and apparently they're really heralding these because they have more control, or it's easier for them to manipulate. For the Russians, I don't nothing to do with US elections and whatnot. You know, that's a whole different kettle of fish in terms of accountability and transparency. But for the Russians, it looks like they're putting things in place that means that they can very easily fake results. Or do they stop this guy? So do they allow the elections to go ahead and then, fiddle the results? Or do they do what they've done to certain people? So the woman that was running or trying to run recently, and they said, oh, you filled out your paperwork wrong, and they basically invalidated her from running. Do they say, oh, you've got signatures from 39 of the 40, but it turns out these signatures aren't properly done from the 40 regions, so you can't actually run? It's more likely they'll do something like that. There's an interesting situation where the Kremlin will have to decide how best to manage dissent and how best to manage opposition in Russia. I mean, this is a dictatorship. There's no doubt about that. Putin is a dictator. He has a complete control over everything that goes on politically and in the information spaces in Russia. But if you go too far, you can maybe have too much of a kickback. He needs to be able to manage that in a way that seems at least somewhat legitimate, knowing full well that none of it is legitimate at all. Okay, and talking about this is, of course, you know, another example of this is what liberty looks like in Russia. Igor Girkin, who was freely criticizing the Kremlin and Putin on account of them not doing the war well enough, was not freely doing that because he ended up being locked up. And he's now, I mean, he's not a nice guy, right? But some of his criticisms were absolutely on point. Like, he was telling it how it was. But of course, you're not allowed to speak the truth in Russia. So a Russian fascist who wrote for Zavtra, Google it, a febrile anti-Semite, one of the first operatives in occupied Crimea, defense minister for the Donetsk People's Republic, part of Putin's dirty war in Donbass, a convicted war criminal for his role in downing of the MH17. So he's not a nice guy. And he has now been in prison sentenced to 4 years in prison on extremism. On extremism. Goodness me. Anyway, he's 4 years in prison for criticizing Putin, of course. That's what's happening, because that's what liberty looks like in Russia. Yay, freedom. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. I'm going to get on with my second video after a much needed cup of tea. Take care, Toodle Pips.